You'll see it when it, yeah. Salams to all those following this broadcast from Naya Daur. My name is Ziyad Faisal, and it's that time every 4 years when people all over the world, with all their local problems, conflicts, and crises, put aside their votes and tune in to follow the US elections, which is not so surprising after all, considering how it is, after all, the most world. And now we've seen that as some of the states take their time with counting the votes, particularly with mail-in ballots playing a role in that delay, it appears that the final outcome is still hanging in the balance. At this moment, of course, the Biden campaign and Democrats in general have perhaps more reason for optimism, as we've seen President Trump go on some of his typical rants on Twitter and so on. So that's been very interesting to watch. So today at Naya Daur Media, we've invited two activists, writers, and teachers who can help us perhaps better understand the US elections insofar as the perspective of the left is concerned. So, which of course has been open for debate in the Democratic primaries as well as the presidential campaign itself. That is to say, what is the left in the United States now? What does it stand for? These are things that have been up for grabs. Uh, our discussion will focus more on the long-term processes, right? So we'll be talking about the divides in American society, perhaps that go deeper than simply the obvious divide between voters in a two-party system. We'll be talking about the divides of class and race in particular, and how they've informed the political choices that are open to voters. And we'll talk about the social processes that we've seen in the past few years and how they've essentially shaped the political landscape of the United States and sort of made the Democratic Party what it is, and the Republican Party what it is right now, especially in the Trump era. So without further ado, to introduce our guests this evening. Well, it is evening in Pakistan, although not so much perhaps for Dr. Bair in Southern California. Anyhow, we are joined by Dr. Asatar Bair, who is an activist, a professor, and author of Prison Labor in the US and Economic Analysis, published by Routledge in 2008. He teaches economic theory at Riverside City College in Southern California, and he's written over 200 articles for the Bursen Courier. I'm not sure if I got that pronunciation correct in German, but anyhow, it's Austria's oldest weekly financial newspaper. And he also has a YouTube channel with lectures on economic theory, some of which I've been following recently, and I think we'll be able to share the link. You should definitely have a look at those. So in addition to economics, Dr. Bair also teaches meditation and has served as executive director of the Institute for Applied Meditation. And we have with us Tabitha Spence, who is a progressive activist, teacher, and writer whose work many of us have followed over the past few years. Her focus is on climate justice struggles. And it just so happens that she is currently based in Pakistan, where she has been working, teaching, writing, and providing us with citizen journalism in her coverage of popular and democratic movements here in Pakistani society. So, I'd like to ask our guests, how is it, and there's so many people in the world who wonder, how is it that with with all of the controversies and the disasters of the Trump administration, why is it that there's such a fundamental political divide existing even now, where it seems that roughly half the United States is on one side, half the United States on the other side? Why isn't this more of a why isn't it more of a done deal, perhaps, that that President Trump and the form of politics that he represents is unacceptable? Dr. Bair, perhaps if you'd like to begin.
That is really the big question that many of us are struggling with in the United States. You know, also, why do so many working class people, cast votes for Trump when it seems to be very against their material interests? So, I mean, those are. I imagine the rest of the world must also be looking on in great puzzlement over the situation. Uh, but Trump has managed to. I think his skill is to make everything about himself. Um, he is a master of gaining and keeping people's attention, uh, and it brings to mind that truism, no such thing as bad press, especially in the U.S., where our political education is pretty weak. We have a very strong culture of celebrity, and Trump has managed to spin it as that he is, bravely, skewering the establishment, and I mean, I think that doesn't fool the left, right? I mean, anyone can see that he is the establishment, but and that his interests are the interests of the capitalist oligarchy. Uh, but he's managed to persuade his core group and really build up their enthusiasm, for his presidency as being a very much a break with the neoliberal policies of the past. So I think that says something to his appeal, and of course it's strongly cultural. He gives great appeals to white supremacy, to traditional patriarchy, to a version of Christianity. So these have a lot of resonance, especially I think in rural communities.
So can you sort of like Tabitha, are you saying something?
No.
Do we hear you? Okay, I was just so if you can just come to grips with the issue that you just mentioned, which is the fundamental sort of political question right now, which is one of consciousness, perhaps, right? So why is it that a president and an administration which is objectively perhaps so hostile to working class interests, nevertheless is able to get significant support from working class people, especially apparently white working class people. Although what we've seen recently is there's been discussion of how it seems that he's actually perhaps gained some votes, if I'm not wrong, among people of color as well in the United States, perhaps. He's actually drawn more voters to. So how is it that voters perhaps are drawn towards a form of politics, right? And towards a man who is fundamentally so hostile to their interests. What is the appeal of Trump for the working class voter in the United States?
I think.
There's no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was directed to me. I was just going to say, I think that it's important to remember that the American working class does not have a political education to a large extent. And when considering these complicated issues that we're all facing when it comes to the economic crisis, this pandemic that people don't really understand where it came from and why it's here for the most part, if you're talking about working class Americans, Trump is a polarizing figure. We've seen 120 million people vote over the last, several weeks with the mail-in ballots and everything, and that hasn't. Sorry, not 120 million votes, but it's a record vote that hasn't been seen in the last 120 years in terms of the turnout by percentage. 67% of Americans came out. And I think it boils down to the question of whether people feel that the candidate has, the ability to give their community a fighting chance. And when it comes to Trump, I mean, the white working class, has supported him extensively. Record numbers, as you said, of Latinx community has also come out. People of color have also come out. But what we've seen is even more votes have gone to the Democrats. The thing is, Trump empowers people who are in a weak situation in society, who had maybe some degree of social mobility, especially until the financial crisis of a decade ago, and maybe they returned to some of that mobility over the last decade. But those expectations have been dashed over and over with the last financial crisis, and also with the economic fallout that's happened as a result of the pandemic. And so Trump makes people who find themselves in a weak position feel empowered to do things that aren't normally allowed, like saying racist things out loud, which, as a member of the white class, I can promise you I've seen all over, all kinds of things said behind closed doors that do not, were never encouraged to be said out loud. But he is making people feel empowered by being able to assert their dominance, their white supremacy in that sense. And also in terms of riling up people like Don Jr., calling on a Trump selection army to come out to the polls and harass people at the polls. He's actually encouraged people to come out with their, semi-automatic rifles in open carry states to intimidate people who are just trying to go and vote. So people who are weak want to be empowered and want to feel like they're in control. And I think Trump makes them feel like they're in control. When it comes to the white women voters who have voted for Trump in record numbers this time, which is really devastating because we all know what kind of man he is when it comes to women, and he's a misogynist. I think it also has something to do with the fact that, a lot of women, especially older women, do look to some kind of peace, save them from their difficulties and their struggles. He actually said, speaking to women, suburban women, I'll bring your husband's jobs back. Well, the women are also working and also struggling with work, but they also want to work back to this time when, a great deal of men worked and women took care of the family at home and didn't have to work. And so anyway, it just makes people who feel like they've lost everything feel that they have someone who's encouraging them and who's going to save them, bring back their jobs, make America white again in a way, which it never was and oughtn't to be. But I think that has a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bair,
Also,
if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with those points very much. I think we should also say that, this election really has the character of being a referendum on socialism, I think, much more than any election that we've seen in recent memory. And that's because, of course, of the primary process and because, of the struggle within the Democratic Party to prevent Bernie from securing the nomination. Which is, a very long process, a lot of fear expressed within the Democratic Party. And so that is kind of the hidden story. And of course, everyone said, well, if Bernie runs, then Trump will have a field day and he'll accuse him of being socialist and so forth. But of course, then what happens? I mean, that's exactly the rhetoric that's used against Biden and Harris, who are very far from that. So it's like, well, the Republicans are going to make that accusation anyway. But then it seems that, the policies, which they call socialist, don't end up being on the actual ballot, So I think that right-wing populism certainly beats centrism. I mean, that's what we've seen. But I think left-wing populism is more powerful. I mean, that's if only it were on the ballot. But I think, people don't have the option to actually vote for their material interests in this election.
Right. So you actually bring us to one of the most important issues that I thought that we should actually be talking about in this discussion, which is, you see, the situation of the Democratic Party and the left, right? So in the last elections, I remember there was the general takeaway, at least on the socialist segment of the left, was Bernie would have won, right? That was the main thing that a lot of people took away from that, at least, those who are to the left of the liberal left. So what I wonder is that as we see right now, there are those within the Democratic Party, of course, who seem to be saying, well, Biden was able to do it. We don't know the final outcome, of course, the elections, of course, but it seems as if Biden might actually carry the day, so to say. And then that raises the question of where that leaves people who had criticized the Democratic Party's choices in the primary, who had talked about an establishment within the Democratic Party, which was sort of fundamentally hostile to the form of politics that Bernie Sanders represented. So the question remains, uh, where does the current situation and how things have panned out over the last few weeks and months leave those who had supported sort of perhaps a candidature from Bernie Sanders? Where does that leave you?
Yeah, I think that's everyone's question. If Biden does eke out the win,
Hmm.
he's not going to be having very much of a mandate. I mean, it's a razor thin, lead if he does have one. But on the other hand, if he doesn't, then he certainly won the popular vote. So uh, either side hasn't made a decisive blow here. Uh, but in terms of the left, I think it's going to be difficult for Biden because of course he's going to have a very divided legislature, right, where the Republicans control the Senate, and the Democrats have lost seats in the Congress, so they don't have as strong a majority, though they still have a majority. Uh, so that means that it's hard to get legislation passed. Even if Biden did have an ambitious socialist agenda, which he does not, uh,
Hmm.
it would be difficult to pass that through the Congress. So, what are we going to get then for the next 4 years of a Biden administration? Um, we're going to get not very much, right? I mean, so I think that, for I think there's a sense that the real issues aren't really you're not able to vote on them. I wonder too if when it comes to especially the working class, that a lot of politicians promise them things, and I think it's got to the point where like we don't believe it anymore. What politician doesn't say, "Oh, we're gonna make life better for." They don't usually use the term working class. They usually say middle class, right? Because that's the United States ideology. Everyone's middle class. Um, but that's what they say nonetheless, and then often do the opposite, right? The tax cuts only go to the rich, or the middle class end up getting tax increases, as happened under the Trump tax plan. Uh, so I don't. It doesn't feel like there is a way to actually vote for your interests, and so then you vote on the basis of these other things, or on the basis of these hopeful promises that jobs will come back, even though every policy is going in the opposite direction.
Um,
So, yeah, Tabitha, please.
um, yeah, in the event of a Biden victory, which is looking quite likely, I think that it's really important to remember that the progressive base has grown massively, and even people who were maybe mainstream Democrats or liberals before were influenced by Bernie's ideas, not just Bernie, but also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the squad, all of who have successfully been reelected to the Senate. But these are progressives in the Democratic Party. And so these policy ideas, Medicare for all, for instance, a Green New Deal that gives jobs to everyone who needs them, especially marginalized communities, $15 minimum wage, all of these policies, are on the agenda because Bernie put them there. 5 years ago, uh, talking about socialism as a socialist, an American socialist, was really difficult with the average person because people don't know what it means, or at that time didn't accept socialism equals bad equals authoritarianism. That's it. And so, in these policies that are being pushed by Bernie and the Justice Democrats aren't even really socialists, as Dr. Bair was saying, but they're at least more democratic socialists. They're more progressive policies. They certainly would make a difference when you consider the different multiple crises that we're facing today when it comes to the mass unemployment, when it comes to the health pandemic, when it comes in healthcare, when it comes to just being able to pay the rent at this time. Like these policies would make a huge difference for people across the board. And that's one reason that a lot of people who voted for Trump last time actually may have voted for Biden, for Sanders if he had gotten the ticket. And so I do think if Sanders had the ticket, things would be looking very different. The race would not be so close because people can understand when it's spelled out clearly to them instead of made, confusing. What is in their best interest? What is in the interest of future generations as well? And so I think that this referendum on socialism is this election being viewed that way, it certainly makes a lot of sense. And the thing is, people didn't vote for Biden, they voted against Trump. Even mainstream Democrats, like many of my relatives, they weren't inspired by Biden. They just knew that we had to get Trump out of the White House. And I think there's wide consensus on that across the Democratic end of the spectrum and farther left than that. But when it comes to like what we're going to do once Biden is in the White House, we do know that, as Dr. Bair was saying, that he doesn't have a progressive agenda. He is an establishment Democrat. He raised more funds than anyone has in history, largely from massive companies who have their interests, and they are going to expect that his executive decisions and the legislation that he promotes will reflect their interests. But you could see from, I'll just read out a tweet from Sean King. He said, "Dear Biden, Republicans didn't vote for you. Even fewer voted for you than voted for Hillary in 2016. If you win this, your agenda and your appointments need to be for the actual people who put you in office, period." And so who put him in office? That's the thing. I think most of the people who put him in office don't want, to push for a healthcare plan that isn't going to address the issues of 30 million people who don't have adequate health insurance during a global pandemic.
So I can't resist asking the two of you at this moment, at this point in our discussion, is it fair to say that perhaps Bernie represented a form of politics that was perhaps too radical for the average US voter, especially for the average Democratic voter? Perhaps was he going to alienate people with rhetoric or with policies or policy recommendations that were perhaps too radical for America, even if socialism is perhaps no longer as bad a word as it once was? Was Bernie too radical? Was it, on the balance, the right choice to go with Biden, who, as a candidate, who nevertheless, the two of you seem to think is perhaps not as nearly as progressive or left wing as the times demand, perhaps? Is it fair to
I
say
don't
that
think
Bernie was too radical?
I don't think there's any question that Bernie would have done very well in the election and would have. Bernie was the front runner throughout the primary process. He almost secured the nomination in 2016, despite being basically an unknown candidate who had no national name recognition and was only known, by the very few who closely follow politics or who lived in the Northeast. So for him to be able to mount a very credible challenge to, one of the most well-known, political figures, Hillary Clinton, it speaks to the appeal of those policies, and that he was addressing crowds of first 5,000 and 10,000 and 20,000. I mean, these are absolute rock star numbers that unknown politicians don't get. They have town halls of a few dozen people, maybe. So Bernie had, not only this this mass movement, but also a very successful organizing model, a very decentralized, a very smart, set of, roadmap in terms on a campaign level. So, you know, um, to then in 2020, Bernie is the absolute front runner, but is not given that attention by the media, and then you have a whole succession of Democratic candidates who muddy the waters and inject all this wonkery into the into the thing and say, oh yes, we're for Medicare for all as well, but then when you look at their plan, it's like, there's a lot of confusion that gets introduced here. Uh, but I think that's all a sign that people want healthcare. I mean, that's an incredibly popular uh, platform, right? So there's a reason why all of the Democratic contenders, with the exception of Biden, kind of adopt some version of this. Uh, the minimum wage movement, uh, less
Hmm.
so. It's a little bit less strong in 2020 than it was in 2016, but that's only because a lot of big states actually agreed to do it. I mean, New York and California have agreed to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The focus has shifted from the federal level, where it's still 7.25 and 2.13 an hour for those who are earning tips. And by the way, for people who are interested, I have a whole video on my YouTube channel which analyzes the economics of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Uh, so people can check that out if you're interested in a more detailed look. Um, so I think Bernie's candidacy really did change the terms of the debate there and showed everyone that these policies are very, very popular indeed. And it was only through severe manipulation of the primary results. Now we know that for a fact that happened in 2016. Years later, right? We've been able to get this information. Uh, we suspect that it happened this year as well. We know that many polling places were closed. People had to wait in hours in line to vote in the primaries. This is the manipulation of the DNC to get rid of Bernie. But that doesn't say to me that his policies were too radical. That says to me that the oligarchy, which runs the United States, doesn't like them. But whatever the oligarchy doesn't like, I like. I mean, I think that we have to kind of keep in mind, right, who runs the media in the United States, and that has a lot to do with our discourse on politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, there's a reason that people are taking these policies seriously and engaging with them. And the Sunrise Movement, Black Lives Matter, all of the major movements sweeping America today, which includes workers organizing who aren't even unionized, for instance. All of them have made it very clear that they do intend to, push this administration, whichever administration it is, to actually implement policies that are going to make a difference in the lives of people and address the crises that we're facing today. And so, I very much agree with Dr. Bair. And Yeah, as one person who from Arizona, an activist, a Latina woman was quoted as saying on Democracy Now, we're not waiting to find out who the next winner is, but who the next target of our struggles is. So, we don't see Biden as an ally, but we do know that the movements have actually grown and continue to grow. And I think that's very much a result of Bernie's success and the success of other people stepping up like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Presley, AOC, Cori Bush, who was actually homeless and a Black Lives Matter activist who was just elected. People are stepping up. People who never would have seen themselves as politicians or going into politics or seeing how, to do something to address the issues that their families and communities are facing. You actually really have to work to put yourself in a position of power, because we can't count on people like Biden or even Harris, to do the right thing. And that means our movements are going to have to keep organizing, keep growing, and keep pushing. And also, keep building new institutions, rather than expecting the same old institutions that were designed to protect a certain kind of status quo to, be the salvation that we need. It's not going to happen. So we have to be creative enough to put forward not just the ideas and policies, but actually to build different kinds of institutions that are capable of addressing the crises that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. So this actually brings us to perhaps another very important issue, from at least from a progressive perspective, in the U.S. elections right now, and more generally, sort of in U.S. politics. And this is we see something contradictory going on. On the one hand, there is an overall rightward shift in global politics, it would seem, right? So you have the rise of these sort of populist right wing sort of movements and leaders all over the world, and the United States, of course, is exhibiting a sort of a very clear example of that sort of leadership in the form of Trump. And on the other hand, you have the rise in the United States of what is now called the Squad, right? So these progressive socialist members of Congress, women of color, people such as Ilhan Omar, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Presley, I think, unless I get the name wrong. And now apparently the Squad has also expanded. So how do you explain this apparent sort of contradiction, where on the one hand there is a general shift towards the right in terms of public discourse, and yet at that very moment in American history, it seems that socialism is perhaps no longer the sort of the bad word in politics that it once was. How do you explain sort of this shift, and what do you make of the rise of people in politics, Congress people, such as the so-called very aptly named the Squad? How do you feel about the rise of these people at the exact moment when there is such a disastrous sort of far right in a lot of public discussions? Dr. Bair, perhaps you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to keep in mind that the United States is an extremely right-wing country,
Mm-hmm.
and we are good at projecting the illusion that we have, a Democratic Party that is different. We don't really have a two-party system. We have, basically two extremely pro-corporate, pro-business parties. One is slightly more moderate. I mean, the Biden is a Republican. I mean, that's his politics. So all of the elements of traditional conservatism are there, from fiscal conservatism to the focus on law and order, with its coded racial messages there, and of course being the architect of the 94 crime bill and so forth, co-sponsored by noted segregationist Strom Thurmond, but also being very pro-imperialistic, pro-military. When Biden sees this massive Black Lives Matter movement, which is, I mean, this is one of the most remarkable developments of 2020, the fact that there are thousands and thousands of demonstrations all over the United States that involve millions of people. And that we would have a statement like defund the police, which,
Mm-hmm.
this was something that only very radical people, Angela Davis and so on, right, would say this, going back to the 1970s. But to have that be a widespread and popular statement is just remarkable. And by the way, that's moved the needle on popular opinion in the United States quite significantly. Now, this is still a minority position, and there is debate and so forth. A lot of pundits say, "Oh, that's a disaster," to use that phrase. Uh, it's a vanguard type of phrase, right? I mean, it is designed to move the discourse in a different direction than where it's been in the past. But just the sheer number of videos that have come out of the appalling violence of the police, where it is clearly not warranted, and then couple that with the rising interest in a kind of analysis, a structural analysis of the system that moves away from, oh, is this or that police officer a good person, right? And that's a very limited way of looking at it, right? These are structural forces which lead to these murders and executions of, many black men in the United States. And that has a lot of resonance, I think, because though the United States is politically very uneducated, there's a very strong ethos of fairness in the United States. And I think that that
Mm-hmm.
is, drawing into it a much greater focus. And, there's also been a lot of progress made by, anti-racist activists to try to raise the consciousness. So I think, people are more aware of those issues, and especially, I have to say, especially white people, right, are much more aware of these issues than they have been even in the recent past. Uh, and yet, there's a kind of a disconnect because we see millions on the street protesting racist violence. Uh, how does that connect to politics, right? Like, these are not things one can vote on. Again, right? One can't really vote on any of the important things, right? Are you voting on an economic package that is actually going to make your life better? I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that relative to Trump versus Biden. Biden has not talked much about that, to be honest, right? He's mostly just, as you say, right? He's mostly just said, "I'm an alternative to Trump," and there also isn't, this whole upsurge that says, we want to defund the police, or we're concerned that police are incredibly racist. Now, we could add to that that police are also very, much oppressive toward the poor. It's like how many things are how many crimes in the United States are basically just a result of poverty, and that the law enforcement, of course, is very class based, right? So anyway, but that hasn't emerged so much as part of the discourse. Uh, but again, when you look at what the candidates say, of course, Trump is very much on the side of the police. He makes all kinds of racially coded statements. He thinks that the police should, rough people up on their way to the, whatever. So I mean, which they
Mm-hmm.
already, of course, they already do, right? I mean, and then Biden, it's like, well, when asked to offer an alternative, Biden says, "Well, we're not going to defund the police, right?" So, there isn't a way. The candidates are pretty much the same on that level. I mean, this is the kind of thing that leads people to say voting doesn't really matter, right? And we have obviously a very significant block of people in the United States who don't see much hope for the electoral process. Now, whether we disagree or not, right? There's the question, of how it's perceived, right? Um,
Right.
so, I think we have to kind of keep in mind the rightward shift that we see is not because of people's attitudes. It's not because of polls or whatever. It's because of a constriction, of the franchise, right? Largely through voter registration laws and so on. Uh, and also, the two-party duopoly system where real alternatives are excluded. These are the kinds of things that depress turnout. So, we have we're able to have, if there is an enthusiastic minority bloc, which for Trump, which there is, right? I mean, uh, they can do quite well, even though this group is maybe somewhere between 30 to 35%, something like this, right? How can a group that's 30 to 35% of the voting populace win? Well, it's because it's non-voters. It's because there's two minority segments, Democrats and Republicans, but they're highly partisan. But then in that situation, the one that has the more mobilized base will absolutely win. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Right. So we need to we are now moving towards the end of our broadcast, primarily because we've actually gone on for a fair while. I would just like to conclude with the final question, with the few comments perhaps from our two guests on sort of where does the current political moment leave the American left going forward. There are concerns that perhaps whatever the outcome, it is the left that is going to be perhaps blamed for the situation of the Democratic Party, either as we've earlier discussed, as perhaps proposing things that were too radical, which of course which you say is not the case, or perhaps for somehow actually creating the sort of the conditions politically where a project like that of Trump can actually sort of be relevant. So, in short, where to from here? What's left in the US going beyond this point and these elections?
I want to address that comment that just came up that said, why are there mass arrests under Democratic governors? The reason for that is that the Democrats are very much the party of law and order, as much so as the Republicans. They're not in favor of, both parties are really united on this, are not in favor of people hitting the streets to protest. We have a very much an anti-protest culture in the United States as well. These protests are, excoriated by the media. They're accused of being violent. We know that a lot of the, this is a country where, one can go on the media and say, these violent protesters are destroying America because they looted a Walmart, and say that that's violent, right? Look, taking a few items off of a shelf, right? Or even breaking a window, this isn't violence, right? Violence is against people, right? Violence is against living beings. We're like very comfortable because of decades of political discourse in the United States where we equate, property destruction with actual violence. I mean, these are not the same, right? And the Democrats are very much play into that, and they like polite protest or something. But then when it comes down to it, there's actually no form of anti-establishment protest that they really like, except perhaps the most symbolic and ineffectual kind.
Where does this leave? If I may, where does this leave the outlook for the U.S. left going forward from here? Knowing that the Democratic establishment perhaps wants a certain sort of decaffeinated form of perhaps left-wing or progressive politics, where does that leave, if one might call it, the actual left? What are the prospects for it perhaps in the next few years?
I think we'll see these protests continue. I don't think the underlying conditions have changed, but we might see them over different issues.
Yeah, and I also think that means we need to push for the types of legislative changes that actually put more power into the hands of people on the ground. So in other words, we need to be pushing for some kind of non-reformist reforms that open up revolutionary possibilities, because the only way we're going to address the crises of the climate crisis, for instance, and the pandemic, which is very much coming pandemics, is by making massive structural changes that the American empire is not prepared to usher in, will not usher in. It's going to mean action on the ground. It's going to mean that the people who manage to get in office to keep pushing. And it's also going to mean that we need to start talking about a different kind of progressive internationalism, because the nation states that we have today are not going to take us in the direction that we need to go. We need to organize locally, and we need to also organize across global supply chains internationally.
Right. Thank you so much, Tabitha Spence and Dr. Asatar Bair. I wish we had more time to continue our discussion. There's obviously aspects of the political and social dynamics at play in the US right now, which we could have gone into further detail. But due to the constraints of our format, we must conclude our discussion at this moment. But thank you so much for having joined us, especially Dr. Bair, because I imagine it's actually early in the morning for you. And thank you so much uh, to our members of the audience, especially those who sent in questions, one of which actually Dr. Bair responded to. We will, of course, continue to have discussions on the US elections and also sort of how this relates to sort of like international relations and to how the rest of the world then can process perhaps and relate to what's happening within the US elections and in US politics right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.